As always, you can. Yeah, you want to go for it? Hello and welcome to A Century in Cinema. I'm Arthur.
And I'm Andrew.
And this is a podcast where we discuss a classic film from every year. This week we're in the year 1962, taking a look at The Manchurian Candidate from director John Frankenheimer and starring Frank Sinatra, Lawrence Harvey, and Angela Lansbury. And I'll tell you, I really like weeks like this where we have a film that's so tied to what's going on in the world. It's part of the reason that I really like this whole project in general, going through year by year and following what's going on in the world, what's going on, especially in America, because we're from America.
Well, and you had mentioned a couple of weeks ago that you wanted to swap this film. I had seen both this film and the film you wanted to swap it with. And that was my main reasoning for not wanting to swap it, was because we've been doing this whole history thing. And I was thinking, no, you have no idea how perfect this movie is for this podcast. So I'm really excited to get to do this episode as well.
All right. When I think of the early 1960s, it just feels like The Manchurian Candidate just sums it all up. It's right there.
And what's going to happen later. But we'll get into that in a moment.
It's, what's the word for, like...
prescient.
It's prescient, yeah. So what's going on in 1962? Well, I'll get through some of the little stuff first. John H. Glenn Jr. becomes the first American to orbit the Earth. The first Beatles single, Love Me Do, is released over in the UK. The first Walmart opens.
That's crazy, though, that both of those things, to imagine that in 1962, that Walmart and Beatles weren't just these things that everyone knew about yet.
Not yet. I know so little about music, but I do know Bob Dylan, and he's big now. On TV, you have the Beverly Hillbillies, and the first James Bond movie, Dr. No, which feels like a big deal. But we'll get into other films that come out in 1962 as well. Marilyn Monroe dies this year.
Oh.
Commits suicide, right? Or a drug overdose?
It's a drug overdose.
Well, there's the conspiracies around it.
No, yeah, it was the mafia, John F. Kennedy. It was all that.
Now, the big event for the year in 1962 has got to be the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October, it's discovered by American intelligence that the Soviet Union has moved ballistic missile facilities onto the Cuban mainland and may be setting up for nuclear missiles to launch into the United States. This is in reaction to the United States placing their own ballistic missiles in Turkey and Italy, which are right next door to the Soviet Union. Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev both think that they can get away with this because of the U.S. President John F. Kennedy appearing to be kind of naive and weak, especially after the Bay of Pigs is a complete disaster. It is considered to be the closest the Cold War ever came to becoming a full-scale nuclear war because of this tense standoff between the United States and Soviet Russia. I just think it's such an interesting moment in world history. I've read a really fascinating and terrifying book called 1 Minute to Midnight that goes through, like, minute by minute what's going on during this stalemate.
It's one of the events in the world that I think of when I think the apocalypse could have happened before I was even born.
Yeah.
Because truly, if it had gone off and it had turned into full nuclear warfare, the world as we know it most likely would have been destroyed.
And now it's just kind of a footnote sometimes.
Yeah, Kevin Bacon got Magneto to stop it. Who was it that actually? Do you remember? Do you remember the details of First Class, X-Men First Class? I actually don't.
No, I don't. One of my favorite documentaries from Errol Morris called The Fog of War, where he interviews the defense secretary at the time, Robert McNamara. And that is a very, very good look into what was kind of happening behind the scenes with Kennedy and his military staff. I love that documentary. Fog of War is great.
I love Errol Morris as a documentarian, and it's funny you bring him up because there wasn't an organic place for me to bring this up in the discussion. I just sort of got information from it. But I watched an interview with him for my research for this film, and it was recorded leading up to the 2016 election. The interview kicks off with him saying that for the past month, all he's been able to do is watch The Manchurian Candidate over and over again. And he was talking about his paranoia at somebody as crazy as the Republican candidate depicted in Manchurian Candidate is actually becoming president. And a few months later, his fears would come true. Oh, I don't know. There was no good place for me to put that in the actual episode. So we're just going to put it right here.
Let's see. Is there anything else I want to say about it? I'm like I said, I've read that book 1 Minute to Midnight. So I'm just really fascinated with kind of what went down. And I kind of became obsessed with it. I have immense respect for Kennedy and Khrushchev during this time because I think they both acted very responsibly in the face of a lot of people telling them to do very rash, irresponsible, horrifying, dangerous things. There's so much pressure going on. I can't even imagine it, not only with the leaders, but I mean, with the people who are just going about their day-to-day lives in October 1962. And if you're wondering why we are spending so much time setting up this 1 month in the year, it's because our film, The Manchurian Candidate, just happens to be released right in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yep.
I always like to remind people that what you bring into a film, your state of mind, what you're going through, what's going on in the world, it's just incredibly important for your enjoyment, for your interest, for what you take away from the movie. And I watched The Manchurian Candidate on Amazon, laying down in bed, just totally chill. And I can't imagine someone living through the most terrifying part of the Cold War, arguably, and buying a ticket to go see this film when the world might end tomorrow. Weird to think about.
I'm going to talk about a few films that came out in 1962.
Before we get to ours, yes.
A couple of personal favorites of mine. Lawrence of Arabia, of course. You know, we discussed during the Ben-Hur episode how it was this film epic that we kind of struggled to connect with on a few levels. Lawrence of Arabia is one of those widely acclaimed great film epics that is totally deserving of its reputation. It's just a phenomenal film. The scale, the acting, the script. I just think everything about that movie is incredible.
Yes, incredible.
Kubrick's career takes a very controversial turn. He releases his film adaptation of Lolita, similar to our film, The Manchurian Candidate, a book that people thought was too controversial, too sexual, and had no morals, and therefore you could never make a film out of. And the way he made the film was he cast Peter Sellers as the child molester and let him give a wacky, slapstick comedic performance. And it's insane. It's a great movie. The French New Wave is in full swing. We now have Agnes Varda releasing Chloe from 5 to 7, which I think is her best film. I love a lot of her films. And my favorite Godard film, Vis-a-Vis, is released this year as well. The sequel to Yojimbo, Sanjuro, the next Kurosawa film, is released this year. Have you seen Sanjuro?
Well, yes, I have, but I know that it's a lot more steeped in Japanese culture, history, lore, and I just didn't connect with it as a Western audience as much as his other films.
I think that it is so good and so underrated because the whole thing takes place over the course of just one night. And I love that there's not really much violence at all until that sword gash at the very end where it's just this blood explosion. It's really great.
Mm-hmm.
Antonioni's L'Eclisse comes out this year, another part of his Loneliness trilogy in the same vein as La Noche and La Ventura. Ivan's Childhood is released this year, the beginning of Tarkovsky's career. Tarkovsky did not direct the entire film. Another person was directing it, and the producers were worried that they were going to go over budget and over time, and Tarkovsky had made a few short films in college, and they brought him onto the set. he turned the whole thing into a dream sequence, started filming all of this extra stuff, and then finished, I think, a month under time.
This was the film that I was kind of interested in watching for this year. I haven't seen many Tarkovsky films. I'd like to dive into them a bit more.
And Tarkovsky is a tough filmmaker to get into just because his films are so meditative.
Yeah.
But I'll say the same thing to you that I say to everyone else and to all of my listeners as well. The way to get into Tarkovsky, watch it in chronological order. He has a short film called The Steamroller and the Violin. It's 20 minutes long. Watch that first, then watch Ivan's Childhood, then watch Andrei Rublev, and just go in chronological order. It is the way to watch his films, and there is this meta-narrative of him as an artist and his struggle with artistry and with film as a medium that is being told underneath it as well. And then my favorite film of 1962 has got to be Kobayashi's Harakiri.
Yep. And you just had me watch this recently. I loved it.
This is one of these great underseen samurai films. I recommend this movie to anyone and everyone. It is disturbing. It is shocking. It has action. It has drama. It has romance. It hits every single bell and whistle you could possibly hope for a film to hit, and then some. And it also just has this gorgeous, devastating, poetic ending. And yeah, that is just one of those. Everyone should see this movie.
I have a little bit of follow-up. An Autumn Afternoon from our 1953 director, Ozu. I love this movie. I only recently watched it after we watched Tokyo Story.
I should watch it.
If you like Ozu, you're going to love it. We also have The Fabulous Baron Munchausen.
Yep.
Coming out from Carl Zeman, our 1958 director, when we watched Invention for Destruction. And then there is the 1962 King Kong vs. Godzilla, the OG.
It's a good movie.
I really like King Kong vs. Godzilla, and I'll always recommend it to people as the first Godzilla movie to watch because it's quite entertaining. And for a very long time, it was the highest grossing Godzilla film in the entire franchise, not counting American productions. That is until 2016's Shin Godzilla took the crown.
And while we're connecting movies to podcast episodes we've already done, this is the year the Music Man film adaptation came out, and the Music Man beat West Side Story for the Tonys for Best Musical. And also, oh my gosh, just looking at this, I shouldn't have even opened this, but I mentioned the French New Wave and didn't even bring up Jules and Jim, which is one of the all-time classics from that era, and great movie. Did I even say To Kill a Mockingbird?
You didn't say To Kill a Mockingbird.
Oh my goodness, and I'm from Alabama. What a disgrace.
Seriously, when I think of the 60s, I think of a wealth of great films. Just the floodgates are opening. It feels like there's a ton of stuff that everyone is kind of familiar with and you should see.
Oh man, yeah. Oh, I should get out of here.
Let's focus.
I'll get lost in this.
Let's get to our film for 1962, The Manchurian Candidate, which we've already kind of introduced. But Andrew, if you want to give us a play-by-play of what's going on in the plot?
Yes, so The Manchurian Candidate. We are following two army men from the Korean War. Major Bennett Marco, played by Frank Sinatra, and Raymond Shaw, played by Lawrence Harvey. Raymond Shaw is been given a Congressional Medal of Honor for his service in the war, and all of his army buddies are saying that he is the most incredible man they ever were with, and he saved all of their lives in this mysterious event that no one has any details on. Major Bennett Marco, played by Frank Sinatra, starts to have nightmares about a situation in which they are being held captive by Korean communists who are brainwashing them and using Raymond Shaw as their main weapon. Marco finds out that other members of that same troop are also having the same nightmare and decides to look deeper into it. This is a very convoluted plot, so stick with me here.
It's a political thriller. We got a lot to get through.
Yes. Raymond Shaw's parents, Eleanor Iceland and John Iceland, are on the campaign trail to become the vice presidential candidate of the Republican Party. While John Iceland is, of course, the man running for vice president, it is very obvious that his wife, Eleanor, is pulling the strings. Marco dives further in and eventually is able to realize that he was brainwashed, as well as Raymond Shaw, and that Raymond Shaw is not a great army vet, but actually a weapon for destruction. So he goes on the trail to attempt to stop whatever he is planning to do. Meanwhile, Raymond Shaw is rekindling his love with the woman who he met before the war, Jocelyn Jordan. Eleanor, his mother, had originally said that she did not want them to get together, but now suspiciously is very happy about their union and attempts to get them together. They have an elopement, they get married, and he murders her and her father, as her father is a political rival of his mother and father, and then goes to a political convention underneath the ruse that he is going to murder the Republican presidential nominee so that his father will become the presidential nominee instead of the vice presidential nominee. Meanwhile, Bennett Marco has discovered Raymond Shaw's trigger as the sleeper cell, which is playing a game of solitaire and seeing the card for the Queen of Diamonds. He uses a deck of nothing but the Queen of Diamonds and activates Raymond's sleeper cell and tells him not to go through with whatever the plan is. Raymond Shaw goes to the convention anyways and sets up the gun, and Marco thinks that he has failed, so he runs up to try and stop him, and then right at the moment that Raymond is supposed to murder the presidential nominee, he instead flips the gun to his mother and father and kills them both instead. And right as Marco comes into the room, Raymond turns the gun on himself and shoots himself. And there are a lot of details I missed.
Dude, that's an incredibly complicated plot.
Yes, it's a very complicated plot, which is one of the reasons I like the movie so much.
Yeah.
I saw this film on TCM when I was a kid, and this was a film that I watched and thought, oh, I probably shouldn't have watched that. It was just the violence and the sexuality in this movie was something that I could tell my parents wouldn't want me watching, but I became sort of obsessed with it, and I really was so entertained by it, especially because Angela Lansbury, who is someone who I associate with all of my childhood favorites, was just playing this dastardly, horrible woman who is also very obviously in love with her own son in a sexual way, which was, you know, interesting for a middle schooler's mind to try and wrap around. And it honestly was a big movie for me as far as how you reveal information purely through visuals with the dream sequences of the brainwashing trials or whatever you want to call it. We at first see the group of army men in a room with all of these elderly women, and they are talking about hydrangeas and flowers. And then we cut to the same group of men being in this room with all of these Korean men looming over them and talking about how they're going to use them in their communist plan.
Mm-hmm.
And then we cut back and forth between those two images until the audience is able to realize, oh, the women are the hallucination from the brainwashing. And as a kid, to realize that this film was telling me a story in that way, where it was purely visual, I think was honestly one of the big ticks into me becoming the aesthetic film watcher that I would eventually become. Because now my whole thing is, oh, if you aren't telling the story visually, then I don't care what you're saying with your script at all. So it was a big moment for me as a kid, and I've always really enjoyed this film, and I'm very excited to get to discuss it in a podcast episode today. But this was your first time.
Yes, as it always is. You know, I liked it, but I do think that there's some loose pieces in the plot. I do think there's some moments where the film doesn't quite mesh or come together. I don't think that it takes away from the thrills and the entertainment you can get from this movie, because I was on the edge of my seat at the end. There was a great build up throughout the whole thing. There's a lot to take away from it, and I think its place in the early 1960s is just so fascinating. Those little faults don't really matter. Just at the end, why is he even aiming at the presidential nominee? It's just to fool the audience into thinking that something else is going to go on. But it works.
You don't think there's any inner debate going on? Because at that point, obviously, we do know that Raymond is in full control of his actions. You don't think there's any sort of inner debate as to whether he should just go through with the plan his mother has put into action, or whether he should betray everything he knows and then kill himself?
That's the only way it works, right? Is that if there is some inner debate, and I'll give it that. I'll give the movie that, yeah. Well, what was Frank Sinatra's girlfriend, the woman he hangs out with during some of the scenes?
Janet Leigh.
Feel like that subplot just doesn't go anywhere.
I think that is supposed to sort of throw the audience off. I think this entire film is sort of...
It's just a red herring.
Not a red herring. Well, yes, I would say that she's a red herring. Because that sequence when they're in the train and she's giving him numbers and codes, I do think that it's implied that she could be a part of a conspiracy as well, but he does not fall in for it. You know, it's sort of just there to make it a little more thrilling and make you wonder what's going to happen next. And it also folds into the film's overarching themes, which I don't see these as misogynist, but, I'm not a woman, so it might not be my place to say that. And if someone did see these as misogynist, I would understand it. But I do think it's using the basic binary of gender to get across these two schisms. You've got the men, and when they're being brainwashed, they're seeing a bunch of women who are able to tell them what to do and change their brainwaves and brain frequencies. And then you have Raymond being controlled by his mother in a hypnotic way. And then Janet Leigh is sort of this other force in Frank Sinatra's plot. So I think that that's sort of folding into that theme of, and it is untrustworthy women, but it's also untrustworthy objects of desire, and not just desire sexually, but desire for approval, desire for comfort and security. And it's using the binary of gender to get across those themes, which is why I don't see it as misogynist, but I could see an interpretation of it like that. Anyways.
Her showing up to the party with the Queen of Diamonds. I swore that was a dream sequence, and then it wasn't. It's just the craziest coincidence of all time. All right.
Oh, you thought that was a coincidence?
Did the mother give that to her?
I think the mother told them that was the costume party and that's what they should wear because...
I think she said she just saw it in a window and thought it looked neat. Because I thought the mother, tricked her into wearing it too, but then there was a line that said something like that.
But I still don't think it's coincidence because the mother does use that giant Queen of Diamonds later in the film as another part of the hypnosis. It's still inside of the room with him. So I think even that is saying, oh, it's not just Raymond who's people are getting to. The girlfriend's been brainwashed to get this costume. And, the whole thing is this ridiculous over-the-top interweaving conspiracy. It's leaning so hard into that Cold War conspiracy theory, communist taking over mentality, while at the same time being very critical of it, which is something I really like about the film. It's sort of writing this line that I think is one of the reasons why it is able to endure as a classic from this time period, because it doesn't necessarily take a side.
Yeah, criticizes McCarthyism and pretty blatantly.
It's saying that McCarthy was just a communist in sheep's clothing. That's what it, that's pretty much what it's saying, because the parents, John Iceland is sort of supposed to be McCarthy, and his wife, Angela Lansbury's character, Eleanor Iceland, is supposed to be Roy Cohn, essentially. That's sort of what I think the dynamic is supposed to be. And it's saying, oh, no, that they're acting like communism is the worst thing ever, but they're actually just these agents working for communism. I think that's so cool. Again, it's just like the year it was released to. It's just right in the fever of it. It's that there's something so awesome about that to me.
Yeah. So while the film is criticizing them and that mentality, that HUAC mentality, it's also kind of indulging in it in a weird way. It is saying, look at how the communists have infiltrated all of our systems, and they could be anywhere. They could be anyone. So it has its cake and eats it too.
Yes. It eats it too, and it's still thoroughly entertaining as a thriller. It's sort of a crazy movie to even exist.
You know what shot I really loved was when Senator Iceland's at a press conference and he's just shouting and screaming about communists in the Defense Department or something like this. We see the television screen as it is capturing those moments, and we only see Iceland's face. And I just love that because it does remind us, the audience, that perception is important and where the camera is pointing, what people choose to show us, especially in political theater, is incredibly important. And the real mastermind is sitting off in the sidelines. Yeah, I love those shots. Those are pretty early in the film, too.
It also folds into Dick Cheney, George Bush territory, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's so many layers to this film that it wouldn't gain until later on in life.
Literally a year later and then much later.
I was going to say, which transition is one of the reasons why I think Bosley Crowther is unable to understand just how prescient this film is. And it is weird with this film specifically, because when Bosley Crowther writes this review, JFK assassination hasn't happened yet. Cold War hysteria is still probably pretty high. There are things about this film that people would respect later that just haven't even happened yet. So I don't think he hated it.
He doesn't hate it. He's clearly just not comfortable with all of its elements. I don't know.
He found it to be a little over the top and ridiculous.
To be fair, brainwashing and...
Okay, do you think...
It's a little pulpy. It's a little pulpy.
A little pulpy? I think the whole thing is pulp. I love pulp. Bosley Crowther seems to really think this film is trying to tell some sort of potentially true story, and it's frustrating to him. He even goes so deep as to say, there's no way you could be brainwashed for a few days and then 2 years later all of these things can happen. And it's like, well, okay, there's also no way you could be brainwashed in that way in the first place. So it's weird to get into those sort of details when the process itself isn't real and had already been disproved by science at this point. So I don't know. It's
a movie. It's a movie.
And he really loved all the performances, and he even specifically mentions Angela Lansbury's performance, which I do think is the main takeaway from this movie. And Janet Leigh fans must have been pissed at this point, right? They go and see Psycho, and it's being fully advertised as a Janet Leigh starring Alfred Hitchcock film. She dies 15 minutes in. They go and see The Manchurian Candidate, and it's being advertised as a full Janet Leigh political thriller, and she's in 3 scenes. So this novel just came out 3 years before the movie did, in 1959. And George Axelrod, the man who adapted the screenplay, as well as Frank Sinatra, as well as John F. Kennedy, all had read this book, and all were passionate about this being made into a film, all completely independently of each other. Frank Sinatra knew John F. Kennedy, and George Axelrod had started shopping around the screenplay. And Frank Sinatra saw it and said, yes, that I want that movie to be made. He reached out to John F. Kennedy and said, have you ever heard of Manchurian Candidate? And John F. Kennedy said, yes, I have, and I want it to be made into a movie. And so John F. Kennedy kind of gave this sort of presidential stamp of approval of saying, yeah, you can make this movie. It's probably going to rise some tension in some people and be, kind of a crazy thing to release right around time, but I want it to be made. And then John Frankenheimer had only directed a couple of films, including All Fall Down, and All Fall Down had Angela Lansbury in a supporting role, and John Frankenheimer handed her the book, Manchurian Candidate, and said, this is going to be your next movie. And as she was reading it, she realized that he wanted her to play the mother, and just how incredible of a role that was. So she was very excited. And then Frank Sinatra said, no, we're going to get Lucille Ball to play the mother, which I still think is an incredible idea. I'm really grateful that Angela Lansbury is the one who played it, but keep in mind, nobody knew who she was yet. John Frankenheimer made Frank Sinatra watch All Fall Down before he said completely no. And after he watched All Fall Down, he said, okay, I want to see her screen for this role. And that was how she got it. So it was more a matter of fame, but I love where Frank Sinatra's head was, because Lucille Ball is a good idea. It's the same kind of thing, this person who is more known for being in wholesome films and being sort of a wholesome family figure, and she just plays this horrible woman. Just there's nothing good about her at all. So I just like that idea, because they were in the same headspace. They just didn't know it,
Mm-hmm. It is like a Lady Macbeth role. It's kind
Very
of
bad.
meaty. It's something you want to have in your career. It's a good role.
So, yes, the novel was pretty well received, and to my knowledge, it was always received as just a sort of pulpy paperback. I don't think people took it as if this is something that could actually happen. It's hard to find evidence of that, but there is evidence of creators of the film specifically saying, why did people believe any of this stuff? But then I can't find any evidence of people believing any of that stuff. So I don't know. It's hard to tell. It feels like some sort of tabloid circle that...
Well, you're just talking about like the idea of brainwashing someone in order to trigger them to assassinate political leaders, that kind of thing.
Turn them into a sleeper cell.
Well, I didn't realize this, but the idea of brainwashing as of the 1950s was kind of cutting edge. It was very, very new. And it was tied up in the Korean War, specifically the Chinese. The word brainwashing doesn't appear in the English language until the year 1950. And it's specifically referring to the way that the communist Chinese government was trying to influence the thoughts of citizens and in order to propagate their own ideas. So I don't think that that is much different from just, your standard propaganda that any government is going to be doing, especially during a war.
Right.
But there are allegations during the Korean War from the U.S. military that when POWs and people are taken prisoner by the North Koreans and the Chinese, when they defect or they admit to certain war crimes, the U.S. military basically says, oh, no. They're under some sort of hypnosis. They've been brainwashed in some way. So it's actually coming from official channels that this is something that the communists are doing, at least during the Korean War. Now, after the Korean War, later in the 1950s, official channels start to say, no, there's no evidence of any of that actually happening. But you can see how that idea kind of slipped into the public's mind in America and, fuels the fear of communism, of course. So I do like tracing that. I didn't realize it was that recent, that it was that cutting edge for that time period.
Yeah, and that does make sense. It was from an interview with Angela Lansbury, who said that by the time the film was released, there was already science against brainwashing. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because she said that so casually, but of course there would have had to have been, because if people were buying into it that much in the 50s and it was causing a certain amount of hysteria because people thought, what if I've just been brainwashed? Then of course scientists are going to immediately be like, no, everyone, take a breath.
But there's also the new hit trend of psychology. I don't think the public really understands what psychology is nowadays. So I'm thinking in the 1950s when you have Freud and Pavlov, you have Pavlov being mentioned by name in this film.
It's the place where they're being brainwashed, right?
It's like the Pavlov Institute or something like this. But yeah, but you have public figures like Freud and all these new theories about how you can dive into the subconscious mind and start to get into the roots of what makes a person and kind of play around in there. I mean, I think it's funny then, speaking of Freud, that this film has the mother-son incest thing going on. I feel like this film is playing into some of the pop psychology going on in the day. Mm-hmm. It makes for a good movie.
And at the end of the day, that's what I want.
Even if scientists were coming out and saying to the public, listen, brainwashing isn't real, that's total hogwash. You still have the CIA with their MK Ultra programs going on at the exact same time. That was all back in the 1950s.
I was about to say, when was MK Ultra? That is the most screwed up thing.
That's 50s, 60s, and that is literally the United States government officially experimenting with brain control, with brainwashing, exactly what's going on in this film, and seeing if it's possible.
Using LSD.
Yeah, with LSD, with drugs. I'm pretty sure that some of their findings during all of that were then implemented during the 2003 Iraq War with interrogation techniques. So it's official. Even if it's pulpy, crazy stuff that seems like it belongs in a sort of silly political thriller movie, you still have people in power who are taking it seriously and trying to make it happen. I do have a question for you.
Okay, I might have an answer.
I mean, this film coming out basically on the weekend that the Cuban Missile Crisis is all going down, do you think that that incident and that timing propelled its success? Or do you think that its success came much later, after the assassination of JFK? Do you have any sort of insight on that? I know that the box office for this thing was good, but not like amazing.
Yes. So the box office was solid. It was overall pretty well received, but as we've stated earlier, it might have been a matter of controversy. It might have just been a matter of timing, or it might have just been, people didn't want to go see a black and white political thriller. Who knows? But it was not the success they were hoping for. This is where real life conspiracy theories come into the mix. You ready for this?
Ooh, and we are in the era of conspiracies. Give them to me.
So a year later, it was taken out of theaters, which sounds crazy to us and our listeners because nowadays movies play for a month or two and then they're eventually put on a streaming platform or they're released on physical home media. Mm-hmm. But that was not how the cycle worked at this point in time in theaters. Films would be taken out and then re-released and then taken out and re-released. And then once that cycle was done, they would be put on television, which even that was a relatively recent phase of the distribution process. So for Manchurian Candidate to be pulled out of theaters after a year felt it was not the typical cycle for a movie at this time. And there was a rumor that went around for a long time that Frank Sinatra had pulled the film from theaters and didn't want it to be distributed after John F. Kennedy's assassination. And it wasn't just this film. It was another film called Suddenly, which also stars Frank Sinatra and is about a bunch of people who hold a family hostage in a high apartment so that they can get a good angle from a window to assassinate the U.S. president. Ooh. And there was this whole thing about, because as I said earlier, Frank Sinatra and John F. Kennedy were friends. And there was this whole thing that Frank Sinatra was so upset by the potential of him being in any way an influence on Lee Harvey Oswald that he pulled the films. And Oswald had stated that Suddenly was one of his favorite movies. Then, years later, the Frank Sinatra estate or whatever said, no, none of that was true. It was just because of box office receipts. There was nothing there at all. Whatever. It ended up having a very successful re-release in the 80s. Then, as recent as 2015, in an interview for special features for the Criterion Collection, Angela Lansbury casually said that she knew that Frank Sinatra had pulled the films and that he was the one responsible for it. She doesn't go into any details at all, but she was the one who was there and involved with the movie. So I tend to think that she might know at least a little bit of what she's talking about. I don't think she would just say that if it wasn't true. So that is its own little conspiracy, is whether Frank Sinatra actually pulled those films or not.
I mean, you've got to pull the films at some point. They've got to stop playing around town at some point.
It wasn't just about pulling them from theaters. It was about them never going to television and they just didn't go through the regular distribution cycle after the JFK assassination.
Well, you got to think that has got to have some influence on what they do with a film like this, because that last 20 minutes is very eerie.
Yes. I think what's honestly happened is there probably wasn't that much of a distribution thing. It was just Frank Sinatra was probably dealing with that sort of stuff, and he was the one who had rights to distribution. He had his hands in so many pockets. That was the weirdest part about doing my research for this film was, this entire movie exists because of Frank Sinatra. And Frank Sinatra was on this ego trip of, I don't want to be in musicals anymore. I want to be in serious movies. And he just casually knows JFK. I don't know. Just and it turned out that a lot of the women JFK slept with, he was introduced to by Frank Sinatra. I don't know. Just the more I read about it, I thought, Frank Sinatra, a little too involved in things in America, in this humble podcaster's perspective, for being an entertainer.
Yeah. It sounds just like the situation you have after 9/11, where it's like, maybe we shouldn't show towering inferno on TV for a second. Kind of like that thing.
This film came out just right as HUAC is going away, and you can see it in this film, right? I mean, this film content-wise feels crazy radical from some of the films we watch. I mean, people are getting shot on screen.
Wait, do you mean HUAC or do you mean the Hays Code?
Hays Code.
Hays Code.
Hays Code. And that's what I meant when I said 4 years before the official death of HUAC. In the notes about the email, too, is 4 years before the official death of Hays Code. I don't know when HUAC died. I'm not smart enough to know that kind of thing. I just know movies. So, Hays Code. This film feels radical compared to other films we've watched in recent times, especially the sequence where the kid gets shot in the head and his brains splatter over the poster of Stalin.
Oh my.
One of the coolest shots in the movie. And then Angela Lansbury just making out with her son for a solid 10 seconds before they cut away. When I was watching that, I was like, oh yeah, Hays Code's about to go. It's time.
This is a big middle finger to those guys, isn't it?
Yes, the movies are going to keep progressing and getting more and more controversial regardless of what censors are telling them.
Hays Code is officially going to die in how many years from now?
66.
Looking forward to that.
Looking forward to that.
Yes.
Oh. I don't know what we're talking about. John Frankenheimer.
Let's talk about the director. About the director.
So, are you familiar at all with John Frankenheimer?
No. Well, I am kind of now because of this movie, but no.
He'd done a lot of TV work, and he was brought on to direct Birdman of Alcatraz, and as soon as he got on set and read the script, he said, there's no way to film this script without it being 4 hours long. And he was told, I think it was Burt Lancaster was the star of it, maybe I'm wrong. He was told by somebody who was directly involved in it, well, too bad, you can't change anything about that script, and you gotta film it as is. And he said, okay, but it's going to be a 4.5 hour movie. And he made it, and he showed it to them, and it was still trimmed just a little bit, but it was a 4.5 hour movie, as he had said. And so the producers said, okay, you can rewrite it and reshoot it, and he did. And that's what Birdman of Alcatraz actually is the completely reshot and redone John Frankenheimer film. And that impressed a lot of people and was one of the reasons he was brought on for Manchurian Candidate. He made another political thriller right after Manchurian Candidate called 7 Days in May and The Train, and then my personal favorite of his work, which is Seconds, which is a crazy movie about this old man who gets upset about his life, and he goes into this laboratory and they essentially murder him and put his soul in the body of Rock Hudson. It is a batshit movie. It is absolutely crazy, and it's so fun. It's a really good thriller, horror, sci-fi. There's just a million genres going on, and it's super fun. And then after John F. Kennedy died, and he was also friends with JFK, after John F. Kennedy died, he sort of stopped tackling more radical subjects and stopped submitting his films to Cannes Film Festival and sort of became known as more of a working man's director. And a lot of people say that it was directly because of that, because he felt somehow responsible because he directed The Manchurian Candidate.
Yeah, that would feel icky. That would feel bizarre. To go from making this to seeing... Yeah, anyways.
And then Do you know anything about the crazy story about the island of Dr. Moreau?
I don't know.
So I won't go all the way into it, but the island of Dr. Moreau is a 96 film. It is one of the craziest behind the scenes stories ever told. And pretty much people were actually starting to drown and they were getting rained out and things are going horribly. And so the director on the shoot, Richard Stanley, the producer said, "Get out of here. You cannot come back." And someone said, "What is John Frankenheimer doing right now?" Even though he was so old. And he came in and finished the film. And so we got to work with Marlon Brando and Val Kilmer and David Thewlis and all of these modern actors. And it kind of resurged his career, even though the movie was a flop and it was a horrible disappointment. The producers were completely convinced it was never going to be made at all, and it wasn't going to be able to be finished. And he came in and worked a miracle and finished the movie.
What year was that?
That was 1996.
Oh, way in the future.
Yes, way in the future. And then he had 3 final films, Ronin, Reindeer Games, and Path to War. And they were all seen as this huge resurgence in his career. And then he passed away. And I don't know, there's something really inspiring about his story to me that he was, I don't know, on top of the whole world of directing and was considered the hottest, youngest, newest thing ever. And then his career took a huge dip for almost 30 years. And then he came back right at the end of his life and made a few more banger movies. And I don't know, there's something nice about it.
I love that. Yeah, there is something nice about that. I liked his style.
Yes.
Bosley Crowther in that review points out that he kind of has an Orson Welles thing going on, but he also has like a Alfred Hitchcock sensibilities, but there's also Howard Hawks in there too.
Mm-hmm. So when it came to the shots that were out of focus, how did those make you feel?
Yeah, I notice shots when they're out of focus, even a little bit. But you're just trained to when you work on any sort of film or video set, right? You just are always looking for that because if you don't get the shot in focus, you don't get the shot. So when you see shots that make it into a final film that aren't in focus, done by professional filmmakers, you kind of think, well, that must be intentional.
Mm-hmm.
But there was something about this that still didn't feel intentional.
Okay.
And it just didn't look deliberate enough.
I do want to say before I give this little factoid that I actually think it works in the film's favor.
It does. It actually
again,
does. Yeah.
Folding into that other stuff we talked about earlier, how things just seem to naturally be folding into the film's themes. It makes the film feel off kilter, a little like off the cuff, a little unhinged. It makes things feel the way the whole movie feels, and I like that about it. However, John Frankenheimer, being an early director, was very against doing multiple takes and would only do another take if someone said the shot was out of focus or something went wrong with the image. He would rehearse the actors one time and then he would shoot, and most of the time that was it. So that was already in place. However, once it came time to start filming with Frank Sinatra, the combination of Frank Sinatra and Frankenheimer made it to where there was never more than one take. Frank Sinatra only wanted to do one take, and that's what Frankenheimer wanted to do anyways. So almost every out of focus shot from the middle of the film forward is purely because both of them were like, no, we're not doing it again. There was even one scene that notoriously was shot a few more times because it was out of focus. I think that was an early part with Frank Sinatra. And then Sinatra didn't give them anything to work with as far as his performance went for the additional takes. So it just sort of became this agreed upon thing. One take, that's it. And so there are a few shots where it is unintentional, but there's some shots where is it unintentional if you know it's going to be out of focus and you know you're just going to get one take and then you do it? I don't know. It's hard to tell, but it works. But it is funny.
When the guy who's getting half of the film's entire budget, that being Frank Sinatra, doesn't want to do another take, he's kind of like this black hole of power, isn't he, on set?
Yes.
I guess we're not doing another take.
I just like that it's both of them. I like that it's not just Frank Sinatra being a diva. It's also John Frankenheimer being like, oh, I don't want to do another take either. Yeah.
All the accounts I read said that Frank Sinatra was still a joy to work with. I kind of wanted an eccentric Orson Welles story from Frank Sinatra, but it seems like everyone was kind of delighted by him.
No magic shows on this set.
But I did think that was funny. Yeah, I had to look that up immediately. Specifically, it was the back and forth between Sinatra and Shaw when he's showing them the deck that's full of queens, right?
Yes.
Because Sinatra's side of that dialogue is out of focus, but then Shaw's side of the dialogue is very crisp, in focus, and also directly head on. Like, it's a very unnerving shot. So I was like, is that intentional? But it didn't seem like it was heightened enough to be intentional. Anyways.
I still think to the naked eye and to the casual film viewer, they will watch it and they probably won't even notice it, but they will think, oh, it's supposed to be a little off. And I do think it works. You want to hear how good I can bullshit?
Sure.
For that sequence specifically, what the intention was, Frank Sinatra is fully in his right mind. So when he's looking at Shaw, he's fully in focus and he can see clearly. But Shaw is being thrown for a loop and he's seeing all these different queens of diamonds. So when he is looking at Frank Sinatra and we're seeing his perspective, things are skewed and blurred.
Oh, for sure.
And that was completely intentional.
That's all I have, I think.
Yeah. This was a little bit of a more scatterbrained episode, I feel. But yeah, it's also sort of a scatterbrained movie. Again, I'm bullshitting, It's we were trying to emulate the style. I love this movie, and I really enjoyed this revisit. This was my first time watching it, I think, since I was in college. So it was nice to give it a watch. And that final sequence, I love the way they shot the parents getting shot. I think the way it looks so frenetic, and I think those are sensibilities that Frankenheimer had gained from doing TV work that are being put to use for that sequence. And I think that the melding of those styles works really well for the film. So, yeah, and it's just unlike any movie from this time period so far. This is what this podcast does for me. I love being able to put these films that I love in this historical context of what has come before them and where we are in film so far. Mm-hmm. And yeah, we haven't seen anything like this and nothing that looks like this at all, And I love that.
Yeah, and speaking of historical context, just knowing that this came out the weekend that the Cuban Missile Crisis is going down is so crazy to keep in mind, and how heightened everyone's anxiety was as they walked into the theater. Just the Cold War paranoia that this film already capitalizes on pretty well just is multiplied by 100 by what's going on outside. And I think the movie's already really thrilling and entertaining. I just can't imagine being an audience member on opening day and going to see it. I appreciate that you mentioned that films, they keep playing in theaters for months and months afterwards, unlike nowadays. And maybe this is kind of fun to go see after the Cuban Missile Crisis is resolved.
I mean, at both events, I would just be sitting there with a bucket of popcorn.
Just who cares? It's
not about who cares. It's about what on earth could I possibly do right now? Yeah. I'm not Magneto.
I think we're done for this week.
Thank you so much for tuning into A Century in Cinema. Next week, we will be discussing 8½, directed by Federico Fellini, which is code for I'm going to be talking about Federico Fellini for 4 hours straight, and Arthur is going to have to find a way to turn it into a 55-minute podcast.
Should we aim for an 8.5-hour episode?
8.5-hour episode, yeah. Get the coffee. As always, you can find where to watch 8.5 and all of the films that we discuss in our show notes. We appreciate your listenership. Thanks, Nathan Royal.
And Andrew, I'll talk to you next week.
Talk to you next week, Arthur. Well, we really appreciate all of our loyal listeners to A Century in Cinema. And, if you have not taken the time to write us a review on Apple Podcasts, totally understand that. But feel free to just take a moment and write us a couple of nice sentences. Give us a 5-star. It really helps us out on that app. It helps make our podcast more visible to other listeners who are listening to similar podcasts. And it's really easy. Takes less than a minute. So if you can find time in your day to do that, that'd be wonderful. And follow our Facebook page, A Century in Cinema.
I just want to give a shout out to all our Patreon members who keep the show running. Thank you all. You too can become a patron and get access to bonus episodes linked down in the show notes. You're listening on YouTube now, so like and subscribe and comment down below. Tell us if you've seen the film. What did you think of it? Did we miss anything? Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you for the next one.